Greetings, everybody. In this lecture, we introduce the idea of crisis, and we also explore the historical analyses of crisis by Koselleck and Richter. So we are going to be looking at how we think about crisis and also how crisis has been thought about, at least in Western culture, historically. I find that it's often helpful to start with a basic definition. So I Googled crisis, and here are the different definitions that Google provides. Crisis, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. Examples including emergencies, disasters, catastrophes, calamities. Another definition, a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. Decision, that's going to become an important component of thinking about crisis. And then, relatedly, the turning point of a disease, when an important change takes place, indicating either recovery or death. The Rubicon point at which there is no return, and a new state emerges. Each of these definitions is related, but also addresses distinct dimensions of crisis, as we will be exploring further in this lecture. In addition to looking at how crisis gets defined from a dictionary point of view, it's helpful to look at how the language of crisis is used by different authorities in society, including doctors, scientists, teachers, religious authorities, parents. So how is crisis invoked by these different authorities? Here we can see a scientific perspective on crisis, where a collapse of global civilization is posited as an imminent crisis, a crisis that is facing us in the near future that needs to be resolved or avoided. And so we can see from this example of a scientific use of the language of crisis that sometimes scientists will create crisis scenarios and then think, how can we avoid these hypothetical crisis scenarios? But the more carefully we think about the meanings of crises, the more meanings we unpack. It's helpful to think about crises from different perspectives on the nature of the crisis itself. So I'm going to briefly review 3 distinct approaches to thinking about the relationship between the crisis and the observer. An objectivist or materialist account of crisis assumes that crisis is out there in the world, in the materiality of the earthquake or the tsunami or the drought, but that crisis exists independent of people, and that people simply need to find the right measurement tools to represent crisis and then predict the factors that lead to crisis and then try and make an intervention to eliminate those factors or to shape them so that the crisis doesn't emerge. That's an objectivist approach. An intersubjectivist approach looks at how we construct crisis in our language. So there might be a crisis in the world, but what matters is how we think about it and how we talk about it using our language and our important symbols. So from an intersubjectivist account, crisis resides in social interpretations, in the meanings of the earthquake or the meanings of the tsunami and how those meanings shape human responses in the world. And then there is a subjectivist approach, and a subjectivist approach emphasizes each individual's unique subjective experience of crisis. So this is a very much a psychological approach that's looking at individual experience and how individuals experience crisis. And of course, each individual's experience of crisis, when communicated socially, has to be adjusted so that social others can understand it. And so subjectivist accounts, when they become social, they change a bit. They don't reflect the entirety of the individual experience from the subjectivist approach, but instead reflect social codes, social conventions. And we are going to be exploring these different approaches to crises over the course of this semester. So you needn't be concerned if it seems like new information and it's going a little bit over your head. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that the objectivist or materialist approach of crisis adopts what's called a dualistic approach to knowledge, where the world is out there and preformed, waiting to be observed. And humans then become observers who describe, but who do not exhaust. That is, we can never know a crisis in all of its materialities because we're limited by our models, that are communication models, our scientific models. So the dualist approach is an approach to crisis that is the dominant one, but we'll be also looking at the intersubjectivist and subjectivist approaches this semester. Let's consider objectivist, intersubjectivist, and subjectivist different approaches to crises a bit more through the example of the ecological Armageddon of collapsing insect numbers. So 3/4 of flying insects in nature reserves across Germany vanished in 25 years. That's 3/4 of bugs disappeared in 2.5 decades. And that is going to have serious implications for all life on Earth. So we might say that's an objective crisis. Of course, we wouldn't know it existed until it was measured by authorities who have the authority to do such measurements, scientists, not people making observations about insects in their backyard gardens. So an objective crisis can only be defined by particular kinds of authorities. And then it remains relatively unknown unless the news media pick it up. And in this case, The Guardian reported on it. But the news media doesn't report the entire scientific article, but represents the article, focusing on some aspects of the scientific findings and de-emphasizing other aspects. And news reporting is influenced by many forces, including, professional forces, national culture, and political forces. So political influences will shape representation of the objective crisis of the insect collapse. And then consider also that the very phenomena, the objective phenomena of an insect collapse, was likely caused by human activities, human pollution, and habitat destruction. And therefore we could say, even though it's an objective crisis, the insect collapse. It resulted from social forces, intersubjective social forces. So the relationship between objective crisis and intersubjective crisis is interdependent. And then there's the last component of the subjective crisis. How many of you even knew that there was an insect collapse? And if you did know, was this a pressing priority in terms of the list of crises that you keep a mental tally on? Probably not. And so even if there is a crisis that has profound material effects in the world, objective crisis of the insect collapse, and even if the news media do report it, that doesn't necessarily translate into any impacts on the subjective experience of this crisis for individuals, unless, of course, they themselves had been struck. Maybe their backyard garden is not doing well because all the good insects have disappeared. So this is an example to help you work through objective, intersubjective, and subjective crises in your understandings. We're now going to turn to a historical analysis of the meaning of crisis across Western culture. And this is the most important essay to go back and kind of look at how the ancient Greeks, the Romans, ancient Europeans, up through the contemporary period, thought about the idea of crisis. It's pretty interesting, and I'll just be touching on key ideas from this reading, but I do strongly encourage you to take the time to go through and read it. Koselleck and Richter began their historical analysis of the idea of crisis with the ancient Greeks. And for the ancient Greeks, when they used the word crisis, they used it in the context of politics. Remember that the Athenian Greeks had democracy, and it was a direct kind of democracy where the people who lived in the city-states of Athens in about 500 BC, they would congregate in the public square and they would debate the fortunes and different policy options of their city-state, and they would vote on their representatives to make decisions directly, or even vote directly on whether they were going to go to war again with Sparta. It was a very direct kind of democracy, and as you can imagine, it would get gridlocked, and sometimes there would be great polarization between members of the polis, of the city-state, and so that represented a crisis to the Greek city-state. So for the ancient Greeks, the language of crisis was tied to their political democracy and the conflict within it and the necessity of choosing or deciding. It meant not only, therefore, the conflict of the city-state, but the necessity of making a decision, especially a decision that would tip the scales. And so this is the ancient Greek political notion of crisis. And it still is with us today, especially when we think about today the polarization crisis of American politics that is so often invoked and lamented in the news media. Now, for the Greeks, when they confronted a crisis, they had to use democratic processes for deciding on the best option, because they were, at least the Athenian Greeks, were a direct democracy. And so the problem emerged: if we have a bunch of people hanging around in the public square, all expressing their diverse opinions, how do we move from those diverse opinions, the subjective critiques, to the best course of action? How do we reconcile all this difference? Well, for the Greeks, the dialectic process of pitting argumentative claims against counterclaims. We should invade Sparta. We should not invade Sparta. Invading Sparta will increase our economic options. Invading Sparta will ultimately decrease our economic options. This process of positing counterfactual arguments, with one claim making one version of reality and another claim representing another version of reality, and then testing those claims using different kinds of evidence and reasoning, that process is believed to generate a higher order understanding. And this higher order understanding was as close to truth as the Greeks thought people could get, and would of course therefore be most likely to deliver the best policy option for addressing any crisis. So for the Greeks, the idea of crisis included both sort of a subjective, experiential, and reflective approach to crisis, and also the move through the social towards a consensus, and therefore, even though it was socially determined, a more objective, sort of a culminating understanding, policy, or truth. And we see this idea that somehow truth or justice or the best policy will be delivered through this dialectic process, illustrated in the image of the blind goddess holding the scales of justice. And hence there is this important concept that is embedded in the Greek notion of crisis, of conflict and contradiction resolved dialectically into some higher order understanding. In addition to the political idea of crisis, the Greeks also adopted crisis for the language of. In addition to the political idea of crisis, the Greeks also adopted crisis to describe medical emergencies. And the origins of the medical use of the word crisis can be found in the Corpus Hippocraticum. I'm probably mispronouncing that. There's a note here. The Corpus Hippocraticum is a collection of around 60 early ancient Greek medical works that are strongly associated with the physician Hippocrates. And you've heard of the Hippocratic oath of doing no harm. And here is an image of Hippocrates with one of his medical texts. And this notion of crisis that he introduces gets adopted by the Romans and remains with us today. And for the Greeks, the crisis in the medical context referred both to the observable condition, the symptoms, and the judgment that the doctor made based on the course of the illness. And so it is a synthesis of the objective symptoms, the temperature, the skin eruptions, whatever the symptoms are, and the importance of the judgment the subjective judgment, but the Greeks did not devalue subjective. I mean, for them in this case, the subjective judgment is based on expertise. And the determination is, of course, whether the patient will recover or not recover and die. And this required properly identifying the beginning of an illness in order to predict how regular its development will be. And depending upon whether or not the crisis led to a full restoration of health, a distinction was made between a perfect crisis, that would be when you have a full restoration of crisis, and an imperfect crisis, which leaves open the possibility that the patient might have a relapse in an imperfect crisis. So we see here an example of a contemporary example of doctors in an emergency room addressing a patient who looks to be in crisis, and it looks as if a doctor is making a determination or a judgment about the patient's prognosis. So you can see that these ancient Greek views of crisis still remain with us today. The Hebrew people, and later the Christians, borrowed from the Greeks and the Romans the idea of crisis as entailing a juridical decision. However, rather than that decision be achieved by the polis, the people, the city, state, rather than the decision be achieved by them, for the Hebrews and the Christians, it is God who renders the decision and judges his people. And that concept of God making a judgment gets incorporated in apocalyptic ways in the Old Testament. And we'll kind of explore that in the next slide. But for Christians, they live in the expectation of the last judgment of God, a last judgment whose hour and time remains unknown in the future. And for Christians, the apocalypse, which is anticipated at end times, is experienced as both distant in time, but as already having happened, in the sense that it's known with certainty that it will happen, and therefore it affects the past that it casts a shadow over. And we'll explore this idea of the crisis of the apocalypse in more detail in the next slide, because it's a very important construct of crisis. In the New Testament, crisis becomes the apocalypse of end times. And we see that in the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, when an apocalyptic vision is received by Saint John at Patmos. And you can read more. But the important kind of takeaway is that this idea of an end time scenario that results especially from humans' inability to come to a consensus on the crisis that confronts them, whether it be a spiritual crisis or whether it be a biological crisis of insect collapsing. The end time is sort of the last judgment of humanity. And it's theological in origins, but it's been taken up and used by scientists when describing, for example, the Anthropocene, which is a human-engineered great extinction event. So this idea of an end time scenario that is linked to kind of human failings becomes extremely important, even when it's disconnected from its origins in religious documents. The next historical period whereupon crisis prevailed in public consciousness and in the communications of the time was in the 1600s and 1700s. And there are a lot of important historical reasons. But what Koselleck and Richter argue is that the conceptualization of crisis that was incorporated from the past to explain all the political and social turmoil that was occurring in the 16 and 1700s was the medical metaphor of crisis. So the medical metaphor of crisis of the patient whose very survival is at issue was incorporated in the kind of historical documents of the time to describe what was occurring. And this is the time in which the modern nation state, like the idea of a nation state, well, this is when the modern nation state was being forged because Europe was having terrible civil war. And at some point, there was this realization that that civil war was extremely dysfunctional and that they needed to create a kind of larger social organization and then have diplomatic relations. But it was very conflicted. And so the body of the nation state was created and also conflicted at that time period. And adding to the tensions was the Great Plague. It was a resurgence of the bubonic plague. And if you've read about the bubonic plague, every time it went through Europe, it was just horrific. Overall, it was believed to have killed half the population in its various waves that it went through Europe. So tremendous political unrest. And so rather than thinking of a patient as a doctor might think of a patient, think of that same idea of a patient of the nation state. The nation state is it's a baby, it's a new patient, and its future is at stake. And it was created by the necessity of coming together despite all this conflict, and yet the conflict persisted. And so that is why this idea of the medical notion of crisis was used to explain the crisis of the social body or the nation state. The language of crisis became even more important in the 1700s. The 1700s were a very turbulent period. The United States was created in the 1700s, in 1776, when the colonists declared independence from Great Britain by creating their own constitution. And you also had the French Revolution that occurred, a civil war in France between the elite and the plebes, the general population. And so, according to Koselleck and Richter, the crisis was deployed often to describe concrete Civil War situations that divided the loyalty of citizens. Crisis also marked external or military situations that were reaching a decisive point. Once again, this important component of a decisive point in the language of crisis. It pointed to fundamental changes in constitutions in which the alternatives were the survival or demise of a political entity and its constitutional order. But it could also describe a simple change of government. So here we see in this last bullet point that the medical applications continue to apply. Crisis refers to the survival or demise of a political entity. That's the political entity is the nation state, like the patient, and its constitutional order. And so we see an extension once again from the 1600s across the 1700s to this idea that crisis is of a social system whose future is at risk. Koselleck and Richter were particularly interested in and also critical of the ways in which history increasingly became defined not in terms of the local experiences of particular groups of people, but how history became attached to nation states or even a global conception of history. And I want you to think about the ways in which we even represent history for a moment, and then we'll turn directly to what Koselleck and Richter had to say. But let's just start with this Google image search. History is represented in a very generic and also with some of these instances kind of commercial sense. It's detached from personal experience. It is represented and as in terms of these old textbooks or old maps. It is detached from your experiences, your family's experiences, your grandmother's experiences, a region's experience. History becomes increasingly anonymized, detached from experience. And the timelines of history tend to reflect the crises of nation states and their wars. And this kind of reductionism of history and its anonymization are problematic for Koselleck and Richter because they make it appear as if there was a singular universal experienced history when there never was, because everybody always experiences their past in relation to the particularities of their place. And so by creating this universal view of history, it's not going to connect with anybody in particular and rather becomes highly politicized. And for this reason, they are quite critical of the modern view of history, and we'll explore this more in the next slide. Koselleck and Richter describe a linear view of time that emerges in the early modern period, and they criticize the grand narrative of a common history that gets articulated around this linear time. So in the last slide, we looked at this generic, anonymized, and ultimately political idea of history that gets formulated around the nation state and also around global historical time. And what is political is that it's anonymized. That is, it doesn't include the experiences of multiple opinions and peoples, but yet claims to represent them. And so in the early modern period, we have a linear time and a linear history. And if you want to think about time in a linear versus a circular way, that might be helpful here. And you can take a look at this image. A linear view of time sees the past and its artifacts as more disposable because it is always moving into the new. Whereas in contrast, a cyclical view of time assumes that the past will reappear, albeit in slightly different form, but that we have to live in a closed and circulating system as opposed to the linear open system model. So what Koselleck and Richter are arguing is that this linear view of time didn't exist in the way past, and it shows up around 1800s, and that he argues or they argue that it produces crises. In the author's preface to Futures Past on the Semantics of Historical Time, another book by Koselleck, he observes that the collective concept of history was coined in the 18th century, late 1700s, and henceforth organizes specific dispositions and ways of assimilating experience that reflect Enlightenment reflection on the growing complexity of history in general, in which the determinations of experience are increasingly removed from experience. Think about, for example, the national or global events that resounded in your childhood that were so impactful yet had no direct experience on you because they occurred in a place far away from you, yet they become defining aspects of your childhood. So in another book by Koselleck, Critique and Crisis, Enlightenment and the Pathogenesis of Modern Society, Koselleck argues for a link between the origins of modern philosophy of history and the start of the crisis, which initially in Europe had been determining political events ever since 1789. Koselleck sees the generalized concept of history, this kind of national or world history, as universalizing because it seeks to represent all history, but in fact becomes so general that it doesn't represent any history. But what he does say it does, how it works, is that it naturalizes European bourgeois values, especially utopianism. What does he mean by that? Well, going back to our linear time model, it assumes that there is utopianism in front of us rather than having the last days. Technology is going to deliver a utopian future like the Jetsons cartoon because humans have become in charge of their own destiny, especially through their technology. And so they are creating a symbolic representation of human progress that is encoded in this linear view of history. It's complicated stuff, but when you think about the challenges that we face politically and socially today, I think that their ideas actually have a lot of applications, and we'll reflect on a couple of those over the next slides. All right, let's finish up on Koselleck and Richter with a couple of sort of summary points. For them, historically, crisis has referred to a time of intense challenges, especially internal conflict within city-states originally, but then conflict within nation states or conflict globally. And this intense conflicted nature of crisis requires critical decision making or judgment with critical implications for future conditions. It's the Rubicon. Over time, Koselleck and Richter observed that crisis becomes connected to a generalized and linear view of history, of particular nation states, or of a global common history, but that the anonymized and universalized representation of a common history characterized by political crises of its unity, that creates social alienation, according to Koselleck and Richter, because people don't connect to it. And not only that, but the linear view of history promises us utopia. But the promise of utopia is always already contradicted by the lived experience of the vast majority of people. And you can, for example, consider the gap between representations of national wealth, like, oh, the stock market is rising, or the national gross domestic product is increased. And yet, when you look at this generalized representation of national wealth, it kind of erases the reality, the lived reality, that something like half of U.S. children live either at poverty or near poverty. And so these generalized representations of nation states and global conditions don't connect with people and their experiences. That's what fosters the alienation. And also a kind of suspicion that people have about those who write history, especially those who produce the technologies that shape those histories. Technocracy, ruled by technology and technological elites, is perceived as failing to deliver the promised utopia, and instead threatens us with monsters, which problematizes the linear view of history with utopia at its end. And the idea of Frankenstein and Godzilla, each of those characters represents this sort of popular concern and suspicion about technology's capacity to deliver utopia, because so often it seems that it produces monsters instead. And I believe there's a series right now called Utopia that is based on the idea of a bioweapon, is another example of a monstrosity delivered by technocracy. So this kind of world, global history, and linear time, Koselleck and Richter argue, just create political crises because they're so prone to the contradictions of individual experience. Whether you agree with Koselleck and Richter's arguments or not, it is often observed that modernity, the modern period, begins around the 1700s, that it has been characterized by crises. And some of the observations that have been made for the causes of these crises include the transition away from traditional authority towards technical, rational authority. Religion is displaced, as illustrated on this slide in the critical account of modernity featured from St. Peter's List. And so this modernity in crisis is illustrated according to St. Peter's list by modern man, generic woman is not included, man no longer knows what he wants and has lost all faith in reason's ability to validate its highest aims. For modern man, reason can no longer discern any meaning from God, nature, or history. No foundations. Science tries to replace religion, but fails to achieve the same hold on the modern mind. Technology promises to deliver salvation on earth, but we're still waiting on its promises as the continued popularity of Godzilla and Frankenstein illustrate. Another feature of modernity that is thought to create crisis is the anonymization of identity because of urbanization and industrialization. You live in a small town, everybody knows you and your family. You go to work in the factories during the industrial period, lots of people don't know your histories, you're anonymized. And that creates, it's freeing, but it also reinforces that identity becomes achieved rather than ascribed. So you have to work for your identity, and you don't have as much sort of ascription. Of course, you know, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, those remain rather ascribed identities even in the modern period. But there is a greater sense that people are able to and responsible for achieving their own identity. And that means that you have to be constantly reflecting on yourself and what you need to do to achieve your goals rather than letting fate just play out. And if you're interested, I recommend reading The Idea of Crisis in Modern Society by R.J. Holton for more background. If you go back and look in the historical records, I did, so I can say this from my personal experience, you see that the word crisis starts getting used in newspaper reporting very, very frequently because there were all these economic crises that were happening in the 1800s. There were silver crises and grain crises and cotton crisis. It was just like one economic crisis after another. So a lot of social observers of the time tried to explain why were there all these economic crises. And one example of an explanation is the idea of structural contradiction that was forwarded by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx argues that when you have an economic system that is based on fundamentally contradictory interests, like the worker has an interest in getting a larger share of, you know, the kind of equity that they produce, they want to be paid more, whereas the owner has interest in paying the worker less. There's a fundamental contradiction between what's good for the worker and what's good for the owner at the heart of the system. And so that's a structural contradiction that creates all kinds of conflict, but most of the time that conflict is suppressed. It doesn't come to the surface. Why doesn't it come to its surface? Because people sort of accept their socially conditioned position within the hierarchical system. And this is a kind of a caricature cartoon of that system. You know, some rule, some fool being the intellectuals or the religious authorities or the technocrats. We shoot at you, that would be police and military. What is that last one? Is it we eat for you? We eat for you. They're the ones that sort of keep the working or labor classes in order according to this representation. So this system is full of these contradictions, but because people are living in their little slice of it, they don't see the system at large. They just see their particular experiences, and that's why Marx thought the people at the bottom whose experiences were the most challenged would be the most likely to have the sense of revolution because their conditions were untenable. And so that they would be least likely to suffer from false consciousness because they saw how the system grinded through workers. So the idea of a structural contradiction coming to consciousness in the form of a mass worker crisis or work shortage or stoppage plays a very important role in the sociological imagination of what crisis is. In the mid-20th century, a number of scholars in anthropology, philosophy, and sociology explored the idea of crisis in modern society. Talcott Parsons was a functionalist who looked at what happens when social institutions don't function to produce desirable social outcomes, and when individuals aren't socialized within society towards functional roles. He was somebody, as you can imagine from this description, that favored preservation of the status quo. Jürgen Habermas is a German philosopher who argued that there were crises in modern society that resulted from what he called the differentiation between system and life world, and system being laws and government policies, and life world being lived experience. So he, like Koselleck, is reflecting on how in the modern era people live within systems that they don't have any direct experiential control over and can become alienated from. And then there's Emanuel Wallerstein, a global systems theorist who is looking at crisis that results from the contradictions of the global system, using ideas that were taken from Marx but are not entirely traditionally Marxist, looking at the contradictions between the patterns of global flows of commodities and financial resources. And then lastly, we have Ulrich Beck, and among them, Ulrich Beck perhaps focuses most on crisis in the modern period, resulting from essentially developing technologies and systems that lack any kind of direct accountability and are prone to crisis because of the scale of their size. Think about as I record this, we're in May 16th of 2021, and there is still a global pandemic raging that could disrupt your supplies of pharmaceuticals and rice from India. And we have a global system that's lean, meaning that rice is only grown for export in a few places in the global system, and yet we all rely on it. There's not a lot of redundancy. The system is prone to crisis. So Ulrich Beck is a sociologist who has described this aspect perhaps most impactfully. Our next reading is going to be Susan Sontag's The Imagination of Disaster, and she's a late 20th century, early 21st century social critic who looks at the ways in which the way we think about crisis, or in this case disaster, is shaped by all these other cultural imaginaries or cultural narratives that we tell ourselves, cultural beliefs, cultural ideologies, I think you're going to enjoy it. The last theorist of crisis that we are going to look at very briefly today explores the kind of personal identity crisis that derive from hierarchical social systems that position people in contradictory ways because of their intersectional identities. Crenshaw became world famous in 1989 for creating the concept of intersectionality. She explained that people belonging to two or more oppressed categories often encounter overlapping and independent systems of discrimination or disadvantaged. Her efforts were to change that dynamic, but by looking at the ways in which social hierarchies get performed in our everyday interactions and kind of revealing the taken for granted politics of those dynamics, that brings to consciousness the kind of residual hierarchies in our systems that people may not even be fully cognizant of, and that creates a sort of crisis for individuals who experience the cultural marginalization, and also for individuals who may inadvertently perpetuate. And so I think that the issue of identity and crisis is particularly pressing and relevant today, and that's why we're exploring briefly here, although we'll be turning to cultural crises in more detail later. But let's introduce her work now.